So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course titled Trauma and Literature, where we have the final session on Kurt Vonnegut's novel Slaughterhouse-Five today. So this should be on your screen, and we were stopping, last session we stopped exactly and, looking at the idea of military masculinity and how that is critiqued by Vonnegut, and how the representation of trauma in literature in this novel, Slaughterhouse-Five, is a very complex condition which includes agency, absence of agency, this compulsory performance of masculinity, and how the moment of hesitation or ambivalence is seen as a criminal activity and penalized sometimes with death penalty. So there's a sense of being a reluctant soldier, and that in a way ironically undercuts the subtitle of the novel, which is an allusion to Christian knights, the young boys who go out to fight battles for the Christian kingdom, which actually ends up being a duty dance with death, which is also part of the subtitle. And that dance macabre quality, the duty dance with death, is something which is constantly mentioned in the novel. Now, in this section, which is the final session on the novel, we'll talk about the ambivalence that is there in this novel in terms of how it moves away from a binaristic understanding of good or evil. So the Germans are not the evil people in this war, and the Americans are not the all good people in the war. So that Axis Allied forces division is sort of blurred, because Vonnegut gives you a very it's an insider's depiction of war, where there is no winner, there is no hero, there is no villain, and the absence of the villain is something which is foregrounded in the story. In the character of Vonnegut's father, for instance, who tells him why are there no villains in the story. And that is because of Vonnegut's own experience in the war, which teaches him at a very experiential level, at a very almost visceral level, that there is no villain in the war, in the same way as there is no hero in the war. So everyone dies, everyone suffers, everyone perpetrates, everyone's complicit in violence. Now, in this section, which shall be on the screen, it talks about the absence of the word Nazi in representations of Germans in this novel. And ironically, the only time the word Nazi appears is when it's talking about an American character. So that again makes this concept of Nazism very, very complex in quality. It's not as if he's painting all Germans on the same brush of Nazism and evil and National Socialist evil, and it's not. Likewise, it's not painting all Americans as liberators, so it's just more complicated than that, and this should be on the screen. So worthy of note, however, in discussing the Germans is the absence of the term Nazi in the novel. It makes only one appearance by my count. When Howard W. Campbell Jr. appears, the narrator mentions he was an American who had become a Nazi. This detail cannot be overlooked, but should be unpacked to discover how the novel handles gender and war. Early in the novel, Vonnegut's father laments that he never wrote a story with a villain in it. Vonnegut responds, "I told him that was one of the things I learned in college after the war." So although there are antagonists in Slaughterhouse-Five, including Roland Wary, Paul Lazaro, Howard W. Campbell Jr., the Germans, there are no villains. For Campbell, to become a Nazi indicates that Nazism is not an innate state of being, but rather an ideology in which one willingly participates. Vonnegut is fully aware of this connotation behind the word Nazi, especially in American culture, and avoids invoking it because he wants to revise a historical narrative that equates the Allies with pure good and the Nazis with pure evil. While he certainly does not condone the act of the Nazis, he also refuses to see them as an exceptional case of non-humans or beasts. They were in fact individuals who subscribed to the ideology championed by Hitler, sacrificing their free choice in favor of a mob mentality. War does not make boys into men. More likely than not, it denies boys and men of their compassion, reason, and personhood. So Campbell's becoming, ironically, underscores this willful choice to surrender his ability to act willfully by surrendering to a Nazi narrative that explained the world's woes and how to cure them. By no means were Nazis alone, although, as many Americans, supported a counter-narrative that served to validate all American military actions in the name of the just and the right. This counter-narrative condones the Dresden firebombing, despite the city's military insignificance, as an open city. Now, this long passage I read out line by line because I think it's a very significant passage and in terms of the philosophical framework that Vonnegut is using, is espousing, and in terms of the philosophical framework that we are using to read trauma and literature. Now, there is that ambivalent grayness about good and evil. We can see that there's not an axis of evil or an axis of good that Vonnegut is ascribing to. And more importantly, it talks about how the trauma, the real trauma of war, is a disintegration of personality, a disintegration of subjectivity, a disintegration of the subject position, where the subject, in subscribing to a larger ideology, just denies himself the availability of agency, the availability of free will, the availability of choice. That all disappears, and that is the biggest casualty in the war, right? The fact that the subjects become subscribers to ideology, and that subscription to ideology is by no means limited to Germans alone. It's also spills over into all kinds of settings. And in this particular context, we find that the event that Vonnegut has chosen to depict and represent over and over again is not the event in Auschwitz, it's not the event of the concentration camp, it's rather the event of the Allied bombing of Dresden, which is actually not really a strategically significant city. It was just bombed away and decimated as in just a military decision without any thought about the morality of it or even the strategy of it, even the ethicality of it. Now, that's the position of acting out a will, acting out a command, acting out an order without any hesitation, without any ambivalence, without any availability of choice, is the biggest trauma of war, is the biggest casualty of war. Because these are boys who did not become men. These are boys who became damaged people. These are boys who became paralyzed. These are boys who became unable to carry out the will, unable to carry out their actions, unable to carry out the free thought, right? And the disappearance of free thought is the biggest loss in a time of war, is the biggest casualty in the time of war. And that's something which is repeatedly mentioned and subscribed to by Vonnegut, especially in this section. So by discussing Dresden as an atrocious military action against an open city populated solely by innocent civilians, Vonnegut's ultimate message here then is a humanistic plea in favor of individual thought and resisting attempts to deny any person's volition. So volition becomes a casualty, volition becomes tragedy over here because the volition goes away. And the bombing of Dresden, in a way, is interesting, and that's the fact that Vonnegut is foregrounding that and highlighting that, rather than the more common concentration camp image, is quite radical in a certain sense. But what it also does is it shows us there are no good forces, there are no liberatory forces in a war. Every force is evil. Every force enacts violence of the most horrendous and gruesome orders, and also meaningless orders. I mean, Dresden bombing was meaningless in a certain sense. It was a city of civilians. It was an open city. It wasn't a whole state city. It wasn't really a city which was militarily strategic, right? So that just becomes an act of whimsical, irrational, violence. So young men, as the unknowing pawns of these military efforts, function as a beneficiary of this anti-war satire, assuming the humor can properly mobilize the readership. So, as I mentioned, the humor in Slaughterhouse-5 as in Catch-22, it can mobilize readership, it can move the reader, not into happiness, by the way, but into some kind of a sympathy for a cause which is, just lost, right? For a cause which is so nihilistic, for a cause which is so violent in quality, right? So that sympathy that readers can experience looking at this humor and experiencing this humor is exactly part of the dark humor quality in these novels, in Catch-22 as well as here. Right, so and there are instances in the novel where there is this whimsicality is foregrounded. So, for instance, the character of Edgar Derby, is mentioned here, and Edgar Derby's appearance and disappearance are both out of irrational acts. So we are told that Edgar Derby is some kind of father figure to Billy, who, as a funny-looking youth, tall and weak, and shaped like a bottle of Coca-Cola, was far from the hegemonic ideal of masculinity, right? So And look at the way in which the masculinity of Derby as well as Billy are represented through some very mundane, commercial, consumerist metaphors. They look like a bottle of Coca-Cola, which is hardly the image of hegemonic, military, strong masculinity. It's got nothing to do with this white masculine veiler that the Christian knightly setting, a knightly image, would seek to portray. Now, we are told that later Derby is shot by a firing squad for stealing a teapot, a fact which Vonnegut reveals from the outset of the novel, right? So, if you remember the opening of the novel, which we did in an earlier session, he mentions that people got shot and killed for stealing the wrong teapot, for stealing a teapot which was not theirs. Now, this hardly qualifies as military action. This hardly qualifies as an act of, act of war. But what it shows is, this is the greatest evil of war, that it just makes everything so irrational. It just makes everything so whimsical, so random. People can just survive, get killed, regenerate themselves by pure acts of accident. So, the war, what it does, it really accentuates the accidentality of our existence, the accidentality of our survival on this planet. So in a wartime situation, that just accelerates it. That awareness, that knowledge of accidentality is just so strong and so in your face that you just have to become cynical after that. And this is a cynicism which extends into dark humor, which extends into dark comedy, into grey comedy, as this article mentions, which is how it gets manifested in a novel like Slaughterhouse-Five. Right, so Derby's death does not diminish his courageous confrontation at the same time. It fails to cause any noticeable change, right? So no matter, that again completely undercuts any idea of martyrdom, any heroism or any glamour or any intensity invested to martyrdom, because nothing will change. Someone can just get killed for stealing a teapot which is not theirs, and in the process, just die, a very tragic, almost pathetic death, and nothing will change. Everything will just go on forever. In war, even grown men are rendered children, underscoring the inability to control their own destinies, despite an articulation of masculinity that views one's ability to do just that as a hallmark of American manhood. So this is the classic and complete statement in this essay, which promotes how this novel, rather than depicting how boys become men in a wartime, it actually depicts how men become infantilized during a war, how men become unable to carry out their own will, how men become completely unable or challenged in terms of carrying out what they want to do. And this absence of agency is exactly what infantilizes them, right? So, and it's something which we see to a certain extent in Cathy Mansfield's Fly, how the boss in the story, if you remember, gets infantilized in the end because he's unable to carry out, he is unable to remember what he wants to remember, right? So this is the greatest causality of war, this infantilization. So rather than, far from promoting boys into men, far from this transition from boyhood to manhood, which is part of the popular discourse around war, the reality of war, it just infantilizes men, it emasculates men, it makes them paralyzed at a mental, psychological level, it makes them damage at a very permanent level. Right, so, and that's something which we see, that lingering, the residual presence of that damage is there. Even after the war, Billy is unable to enact an acceptable example of American masculinity. His very name suggests his childlike state. Billy as a diminutive of William. It's like a shrinking of something. As William becomes Billy, so it just shrinks into a smaller thing. And that again is obviously symbolic of the infantilization that he has. It just becomes a boy from a man. It becomes some kind of a helpless, vulnerable boy rather than a military hero. While Pilgrim alludes to his disconnectedness from the world that leads them to travel between time and place, right? So far from being a Christian metaphor, far from being a metaphor of knightly quest, Pilgrim just denotes disconnectedness. Pilgrim denotes some kind of alienation. He's just wandering away listlessly. He's wandering away aimlessly, and that is the Pilgrim metaphor in question here. Believing himself to be an abductee, Billy frustrates his family, who perceives what today might be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. Now, mind you, as I mentioned, this term, this classification, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, only came into being during the Vietnam War, so it wasn't really around when Billy was fighting the Second World War. It had a very different kind of name. Soldiers were seen as hysterics. Soldiers who suffered nervous conditions were seen as hysterics, were criminalized, were court-martialed, as we can see from an example of Eisenhower. And they were generally mocked at, they were generally jeered at, they were generally looked down upon. So, and the nervous soldier, the reluctant soldier, was seen as someone who was insufficiently masculine, is insufficiently, a heroic quality. I mean, it's a very unheroic quality, a very inglorious quality, right? But by the time we came to the Vietnam War, it was so rampant that they had to find out a medical cause, a medical name for it, a medical classification for it, which was post-traumatic stress disorder. His daughter infantilizes him, sternly advising him, if you're going to act like a child, maybe we'll just have to treat you like a child, right? So you can see, again, in this way, it is connected to Catherine Mansfield's Fly. Even in that short story, you find how the woman, they have more agency compared to men. They have more control of the men. They allow the men to leave the house, or they forbid men to leave the house, etc. So there's a quality, some kind of a gender reversal of social behavior which came after the war. And of course, with Mansfield, it was the First World War. Here, it's the Second World War. But here, too, we have the daughter of Billy scolding him for acting like a child and telling him, if you continue to act like a child, we'll just treat you like a child, we'll lock you up. So, so this is the idea of infantilization and emasculation that takes place during the war, right? So rather than a glorification of military masculinity, it just shows you the tragedy of agency-lessness, the tragedy of not having ownership on your own body, ownership on your own decision, ownership on your own emotional state. So Billy Pilgrim knows when he will die, and he does not worry about it, because, as he understands it, he will only be dead in that moment. The Tralfamadorians became demagogues of sort, because this is a different planet in which he's inhabiting. He yields to the philosophy and pledges allegiance to the notion that free will is an earthling illusion, right? So it's just an illusion of free will. But in that other planet of Tralfamadori, free will doesn't exist, so he just subscribes to that. Well, here we are, Mr. Pilgrim, they attest, trapped in the amber of the moment. There is no why, right? So there is no why. We're just trapped in our existence, and there is that acceptance of absurdity, an acknowledgement of randomness, an acknowledgement of accidentality, which is there. There's no free will. There's no illusion of free will. Consequently, Billy allows himself to be tossed about because there is no alternative in his mind. He admires Adam and Eve because they were naked, so innocent, so vulnerable, so eager to behave decently. In them, he sees a desire to be good, and yet their failure to do so. A failure that, from a Tralfamadorian perspective, was fated and therefore inevitable. Billy aligns himself with his inability to act by treating Billy as a comic butt. Vonnegut encourages the reader to resist such a passive response to the world. One must act and act responsibly. Do not allow social pressures to restrict, stunt, and emasculate you. He seems to say, as we laugh at Billy, we must confront our own activity/passivity, challenging the narrator's damning evaluation of humans like Billy Pilgrims as listless playthings becomes interesting. The lack of choice, the unavailability of agency becomes interesting. And it's also the tragedy, the real tragedy of the war, as we can see. Now, it's interesting to see Vonnegut's authorial position in this. He's definitely not laughing at Billy Pilgrim. He's just sort of portraying the character as a tragic character, as a tragic hero of his times. Now, the irony is, and this is the traumatic condition that informs the novel, the irony is that, all these characters are actually pathetic characters. They are emasculated, infantilized, they're rendered pathetic in quality. And that is a tragedy, that they cannot be tragic, right? There is no tragedy available. There is no choice available. There is no agency available. And this complete absence of agency, which also is an absence of tragedy to a certain extent, is what makes the novel so dark in quality. And that is where the dark humor, the sort of flippant tone comes in, as we saw also in Catch-22, the Joseph Heller novel, where the only response that it is you can do, the only way you can respond, engage with this absurdity of violence around you, is through this dark laughter, this dark humor, the exhausted laughter, which is not a laughter of happiness, but the laughter of cynicism, the laughter of nihilism, the laughter of exhaustion, the laughter of emptiness, which is something which you see here as well. Okay, so just to conclude, the novel, so Slaughterhouse-Five is represented as, as a grey comedy. It's something of a sort of dark, comedy about a time which is, tragic but not quite tragic, because it doesn't have the grandeur of tragedy, because it can just be pathetic at best. So Slaughterhouse-Five powerfully testifies that not only are boys not masculinized by war, but that war emasculates them instead, revealing their ultimate impotence in the face of death. This text, designed to appeal to youth, can be read as more than mere entertainment, but as a humanistic endeavor to save this population from the disingenuous rhetoric of the American war machine, as well as the dehumanizing effects war has on the individual subjected to this terrific reality, right? So it just reveals and depicts the dehumanization of war. It just tells us how war, converts these young boys into instruments who would just, execute the will of this, centers of power, centers of political power. This immature, naive boys who will never become men, who will never grow up, who will never, who will either be killed in the war or who will stay this confused male mind forever, will never just become mature, will never have enlightenment, will never really have a rational, normal life. So this is a causal, this is a human tragedy, this is a human death in the war at a psychological, real level. So humor elevates this message, but if only for a brief time, but it concurrently reveals that war is no laughing matter, though laughter may be the only sane response to it. The occasional use of black humor operates as a useful mode, since the style of procuring laughs is also unsettling and irreverent. Now, this is the interesting bit that we talked about also in Joseph Heller's Catch-22. The irreverence, the irreverent attitude to war is exactly how humor gets played. Humor gets executed, because humor is not just, it's not a humor of happiness, as we keep telling, but it's a humor of irreverence, the humor of cynicism, the humor of nihilism, the humor of mockery, the humor of flippancy, the humor of sarcasm, right? So therein lies the quality of humor in these novels, which is also quite subversive in a political way. This rupture of exception attacks the fundamental irrationality of social organization, and ideally calls upon the reader/viewer to become free-thinking, resistant, and proactive, right? So, it just makes us more aware that, we should be proactive, and this humor of the novel makes us more resistant to totalitarianism, to authoritarianism, to acts of authoritarianization, and sort of critically examined authority in a very, very intelligent way. So to this end, but great comedies such as Slaughterhouse-Five take the potential for struggle a step further, refusing to surrender in the face of life's seemingly ultimate absurdity. To this end, humor works to not only amuse, but to awaken and ideally mobilize the so-called listless playthings, to resist the forces that work to deny the subject his or her agency, right? So the humor in these novels, they also have some kind of a regenerative potential. It can also awaken us, and in the process, we also have a better claim of our agency, a better knowledge of our agency or agency-lessness, and it forces us to resist any institution, any authority which takes away our agency, albeit benevolently, albeit in a quality of protection, right? And that's something which we find increasingly resonant in the world we live in today as well. So this is the end of Slaughterhouse-Five. So it's a really profound novel. It's one of the greatest cultural artifacts in my mind in a postmodern setting, and it's a great anti-war novel, but also, as I mentioned, it's a cultural act. It talks about the different stages of war, different stages of human evolution, and how violence always seems to be a connecting metaphor. Violence always seems to be some kind of a vector in human evolution through which certain forms of legitimization takes place, certain very evil forms of legitimization takes place, where certain sections of people are sent to fight the war for the whimsical, irrational power greed that certain other positions of political centers have, right? And this novel is some kind of a wake-up call for us to realize, we should not be pawns in acts of war. And the figure of Billy Pilgrim is exactly this. I mean, he's emasculated, he suffers some PTSD, he suffers some trauma, he's essentially unhinged, he's just a freak in space and time, as I mentioned. But that quality really is disturbing, unsettling, and also in a certain sense subversive, right? Because that state of being traumatized, the state of being dislocated at a permanent spatiotemporal level, that spatiotemporal dislocation also makes us more aware of the things we take for granted and things we should not take for granted. So in that sense, it becomes a profoundly political novel. So I hope you enjoyed reading this novel this way, and we'll just move on to the next text, which is Toni Morrison's Beloved, in the subsequent sessions. Thank you for your attention.